Hello, everyone. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. And today we will be continuing our series on plain language communication in healthcare, integration of plain language content and infographics into HCP communication channels, specifically strategies to enhance HCP engagement. We are proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory services companies. So how can we help you? If you have plain language deliverable questions or upcoming projects, we would be happy to book an appointment with you or your team. You can email us for a free consultation at consult@criterionedge.com. Our presenter today is Lori Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. And now I will welcome Lori to give an overview of our session today. Hi, Lori.
Hi, Olivia, and thanks for joining, everyone. I see we've got a great crowd today. We'll start with this description of our webinar today. In our session today, healthcare companies are continually striving to communicate important information about their drugs and devices to diverse audiences comprised of patients, caregivers, healthcare professionals or HCPs, and the general public. The use of plain language written communication can help ensure key health information and clinical research findings are understandable and accessible to all. But you might wonder, isn't plain language intended only for patient and caregiver consumption? HCPs want factual, scientifically rigorous content, not the simplified messaging of plain language writing. The answer is not always. The deliberate and targeted incorporation of plain language content into selected HCP communication channels can be an effective tool in your omnichannel communication plan. And remember, content is your user's experience. Make your words count. This presentation in our deep dive plain language webinar series examines how innovative use of plain language and infographics in HCP communication assets can support medical affairs as part of its omnichannel communication framework. Some of the things we'll be talking about today are key elements of plain language content, what it is and what it isn't, how incorporation of plain language content into HCP-focused assets can create added value in HCP patient interactions. Common content formats that can be enhanced by the use of plain language content, and elements of the navigable visual SRD, more on that later, and why HCPs prefer this format. So for those of you that are not new to this plain language webinar series, you've seen this slide before. Let's start here. Let's acknowledge that the information, oh, there we are. Sorry, Olivia, I didn't see that you hadn't switched over. Let's acknowledge that the information overload that we all experience. Information is everywhere, everything, everywhere, and all at once. So in this communication multiverse of parallel content channels, multiple formats, and diverse sources of information, all vying for the eyes, ears, time, and attention of your intended audience, how do you create content that meets your communication goals and at the same time adds value to your audience. What is plain language writing? Today we'll discuss how content, when written in plain language, can be a valuable addition to your omnichannel information asset by increasing value to the intended HCP audience and extending the reach of the information to include patients and caregivers. So what is plain language writing? It is writing that is clear, concise, well organized, and follows other best practices appropriate to the subject or field and intended audience. These are some reminder slides. So in the next few slides, I'm going to do some reminder slides. If you've come to this series before, you may have seen them in the past, but it's always good to do a reminder. The plain, one more flip back there, Olivia, I'm sorry. I wasn't quite done. There we go. The Plain Writing Act of 2010 states, plain language is communication your audience can understand the first time they read it or hear it. The material is in plain language if, after reading the content, your intended audience can find what they need, understand what they find the first time they read it or hear it, and use what they find to meet their needs. So, next slide now. Great, thank you. Let's review some key attributes of plain language writing. It should be understandable, free of jargon, clear, concise, accurately conveys the intent of the message, and should be conversational. It should be neutral, which again is factual, balanced, free of bias, and transparent. It cannot be promotional. It must be non-promotional. And it must be inclusive, genders, nationalities, ethnicities. And lastly, a key attribute of plain language writing is it must be audience specific, appropriate reading and comprehension levels. It should be relevant and accessible and discoverable to target audience members. So before we go to the next slide to show examples of plain language writing, I'd like to say a few words about style, structure, and readability, and ask you to keep these concepts in mind when reviewing the content. Style involves, well, the style in which the written content is presented. For example, written content can be simplified and made more plain, if you will, by keeping sentences short and again being concise. Fewer words are better, and the use of verbs and pronouns to make the content more personable and relatable. These are style concepts that should be deployed in plain language writing. Well, what is readability? This concerns what many of us consider to be, and many tools measure, the grade level at which the content is written. There are several tools available, some for free. They're easily Googleable. You can easily use Google to find them. And these tools assess the grade level readability of written content using a variety of metrics, such as sentence structure, sentence length, word usage, the presence of jargon, acronyms, and abbreviations, to name just a few of those metrics. Lastly, writing structure can be simplified by the deliberate use of tools such as subheadings, bullet points. All of these plain language concepts together, short paragraphs, and even the choice of font and use of white space in the written assets. And all these concepts, when deployed together, increase the accessibility of your message and the digestibility, if you will, of the content and message you deliver to your audience. Here's some examples of the before and after of the originals on the left and the plain language is on the right. I'll give you just a minute or so to read both of those, and then we'll discuss them. So I think that's probably enough time, and one of them may have given you, they both may have given you a good chuckle, because they're pretty, the plain language, the contrast between the two is pretty stark. Sometimes the plain language version is almost laughable. It's so simple, as in that second example, I'm sorry, which I always get a chuckle about. But now imagine, but I'm asking you this, imagine for a moment that you are the patient or the patient's family or caregiver. And perhaps you have no knowledge of medical terminology, or are not an advanced reader, or perhaps have a learning disability, or are possibly not a native English speaker. And most of all, if you're the family member or a caregiver and you're wanting to get information about your loved one, you are most likely worried, scared, and overwhelmed with information. So thinking about all of that, imagine for a moment how welcome would plain language explanations be to you when faced with any of those circumstances. So now that we've taken a quick refresher course on the basics of plain language writing, next we'll examine HCP communication channels, common content formats, and the ways that plain language content can be integrated into key messages to benefit the intended audience. There's a lot on this slide, so let's just start. Being well informed allows for fuller participation in one's own healthcare. I think we've tried to establish that. The use of plain language in some types of HCP assets can help to avoid misinterpretation and misunderstanding of data by the lay audience. Plain language content helps to minimize technical jargon found in many HCP-focused assets, and it should provide unbiased and non-promotional content. So the point of this is that can plain language content be enhanced and be incorporated into communications intended for the HCP? So let's think about some of the key purposes of HCP-focused communication. Some examples you see there on the slide. To deliver scientific education to the HCP to advance their understanding of diseases, molecules, and clinical products, and to ensure accurate, consistent, and innovative dissemination of objective and balanced scientific communication. That's one of the key purposes of HCP-focused communication. Another key purpose of communication intended for the HCP audience is that those written communication assets can take on many different formats and support, a company's medical affairs team as part of an omnichannel communication and educational framework. So most of this HCP focused communication really is generated by the medical device or pharmaceutical or biotech company primarily out of their medical affairs department. And it's the intended use of that is some of these, and the benefits of it are seen in the slide. So let's look at those. HCP focused assets with plain language content That plain language content can add value to the content of the communication. It can promote asset and information sharing. Primarily, the HCP might be able to share it with in their patient communications. Provides multiple learning channels for the receiver of the information. Plain language content improves transparency, accessibility, and inclusivity. Plain language content definitely expands the asset audience into possibly laypersons because of the plain language content that's been incorporated into the communication asset. And as I said, it supports HCP and patient communications and also decision-making. If the patient is better informed and understands and can read plain language content about what's being discussed, that makes him a more active participant in discussions with their healthcare provider. And it can also, and lastly, speed information consumption, even on the part of the HCP. They can go right to a plain language recap of the information in the asset, and they can incorporate the key learnings right there just in plain language, and then move to the more complex writing to understand it even more fully. And one last comment I want to make about the nature of plain language used in HCP focused content. I want to note that the plain language used in these kinds of communications is really somewhat of a hybrid of plain language writing, in that plain language writing meant for patients really is intended to be written at a typical 7th grade level, and that goes back to the readability and suitability measurements that we were just talking about. You can get tools out there to determine that. The 7th grade level, it could even be lower. But the plain language writing in HCP focused communication assets really isn't quite that low of a level. So it's just a bit of a hybrid, but it's still simplified for the ease of consumption by the target audience, typically the HCP. Let's examine techniques you can leverage to maximize readability, suitability, and impact of the content end user, whether it's a healthcare professional and or a lay consumer. So when developing any plain language content, keep that end user in mind. Will the content and format resonate with the intended audience? So ask yourself these questions. What are the most important details of the story that you want to tell? So perhaps you, in order to do that in plain language, you might include subheadings or sections to help formulate the story a little more simply. Another question could be, what do you expect would be the most interesting or relevant information to your audience? So to a lay audience, it might be useful to utilize quotes or infographic images to help emphasize the most interesting or relevant information. What are the required elements to include? Facts, information, data. Use call-out boxes to help draw a layperson's attention to this important information. Understand the information the first time they read it or hear it. That's plain language. How can you test if they really do understand the information? Are there ways that you can check for understanding in the asset? Think creatively. And in plain language, the reader should be able to use what they find to meet their needs. So could you perhaps request feedback or include a comment box to make sure that your plain language content is resonating with the intended audience. So now we're going to pivot away from the basic concepts of plain language writing, as we've been discussing, to how plain language content can be incorporated into assets included in the HCP communication framework. That framework that comes out of, is often supported by medical affairs in every company. So we'll begin by considering key milestones on the educational journey, if you will, of the HCP as they engage in content that is relevant and interesting to them. The journey starts when the HCP first encounters content and material that captures their attention, often as part of this omnichannel framework supporting medical or scientific affairs internal initiatives. This begins that education stage, starting with the awareness achieved through their encounter with the presented material. Think of this stage as the I understand this topic, I am interested in this topic phase. The HCP becomes aware of the scientific focus and message of the company's content, and thus is introduced to the science, the data, and the unmet needs the content is presenting. After awareness, the HCP may continue on their educational journey to receive or to research further additional information on the topic, thus building understanding and insights over time. Think of this phase as the I understand and would like to see more data stage. In the next stage of the journey, as the HCP learns more, they begin to experience trust and confidence in the information provided, and adopt belief in the information and begin to share it with peers and patients. So after that experience, and last to come is action, when the HCP has fully integrated the information and incorporates the new knowledge into their everyday practice. That is the journey of the HCP as they first come in contact with new information, all the way through experiencing it, incorporating it into their thoughts, and then taking action on it. Next slide, there we go. So keeping in mind that the HCP educational journey begins with awareness, the process of educational outreach to HCPs should start with audience profiling and the messages, information, and content you want them to receive. This initial preparation sets the stage for content planning, messaging, and among many other decisions, examining if there are opportunities to incorporate plain language content into those platform channels. So what are the initial questions to ask or to think about when identifying the core content and messaging for a new outreach initiative, for example? So target audiences and experience. Who are the key stakeholders? Are they segmented? Are they separate from each other? Do they have different goals? So understanding your target audience and their experience. How do you want them to engage or behave with the content? What actions do you want them to take after consuming the content? So next, with your team members, develop a narrative and all the internal stakeholders into this messaging and into this content and information that's going to be disseminated. You should get together to develop the narrative. What is your scientific narrative? What is the value story? How will you present these data or the information? What do you want the people that you're presenting them to learn? And what is the overall story you want your stakeholders to come away with? Lastly, determine channels and optimize the content for those channels. What channels do your stakeholders most commonly prefer? Do they prefer direct interaction? Do they prefer email, other types of formats? So that's what we mean by channels. How do they receive the information? And what resources will best deliver the information to them? So what we were just talking about could be called multivalent communication assets. They come from multiple points of view and through multiple channels, all supporting the same message and the same content. So let's create, or let's think about all of those communication assets all going to support this scaffolding, which is the core evidence-based information and messaging. So that's the core. What communication assets are you going to create to disseminate the core evidence-based information and messaging to your intended audience? So for example, let's go back to that, yeah. So in developing these, there'll be an overarching information and messaging platform. Asset types listed here are some of the common formats used to disseminate evidence-based information and key messaging. Think about mass media outlets utilizing TV and radio, web content, which is a whole ecosystem unto itself, where content can be disseminated using many formats directly to the HCP or to the targeted consumer. So long form content, for example, up there, we look at mass media, we see web content, social media, long form content. What is that? That could be white papers, ebooks, plain language summaries of published articles, for example. Infographics we've talked about, and the SRD, which is a scientific response document, and we'll go to that document next. Next slide, then, Olivia. Thank you. So I've included 3 typical communication assets used to provide information to HCPs. Infographic on the left, a traditional scientific response document, or SRD, so we'll be talking about that quite a bit, and then the visual SRD on the right with navigable hyperlinks. A quick note on this graphic. I want to give a shout out and reference a great seminar I recently attended where 2 representatives from a company called FactMI presented the results from a study they conducted with HCPs and patients, looking at, among other things, multiple formats used for the presentation of information and which format was most preferred by each group. More on those results in a minute, but I wanted to quickly credit the presenters and FactMI itself as the original creators of this graphic. So in this side-by-side comparison in the graphic, one of the first things that's easy to notice are the visual differences in format and style between the 3 documents. Let's take a closer look at the high-level defining features of each. The infographic, where you can see the use of white space, the font style, the placement of text and pictures, all working together to tell a story and relate to the intended audience. Written in short sentences or bullets, make it suitable for a broad audience and more of a layperson audience, and useful for large amount of information or instructions. The infographic may or may not contain links to additional information. So those are some of the key bones, if you will, of what the parts of an infographic. So what about that traditional SRD? As you can see very clearly, it's text heavy with little or no graphics. It summarizes key information using plain text, utilizing subheadings, listings, and bullets. Plain text isn't plain language text. It just means it's just writing. That's what I meant by plain text. Utilizing the subheadings, lists, and bullets. It is definitely not written in plain language. The writing style is often straightforward, formal, and professional. Little additional context is provided to enhance the understanding of the content. And traditional SRDs often do not contain links or hyperlinks to additional information. They're almost a standalone document. And lastly, on the right is the visual SRD. And that combines elements of both formats of scientific response documents. For example, it provides multiple links to additional key content details while utilizing graphics-heavy visual style that is reader-friendly to a wider audience. Yet it still has a lot of value add, and it still contains some very relevant information to the audience. And visual, and as you can see there, visual elements as well. So it combines, if you will, the best of both worlds, the infographics display, along with key scientific information that's a little more well-developed than in an infographic alone. And a navigable visual SRD is one that contains hyperlinks, which is we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Next slide there, Olivia. Thank you. So here's one interesting finding from the study by FACT-MD. As you can see, when presented with several different format choices for content and information, HCPs that were polled as part of their study preferred the navigable visual SRD format as their top choice on the left there. Oh, I'm sorry, on the right. So let's focus on the graphic on the right. HCP's preferred format for HCP-focused content. In other words, what format do they prefer for content meant for them? So hands down, it was something like greater than 50% of all the choices that they had voted for the navigable visual SRD. But later, they were also asked, what is their preferred format, HCP's preferred format for patient-focused content? And as you can see, also greater than 56% HCPs prefer infographics, the infographic format for patient-focused content. My only question for consideration is, I'm not really clear if the question posed to the HCP was, what format do you think patients prefer? Or what format do you prefer to give to your patients? So that's a question that I wish I knew the answer to, but as you can see that there's quite a difference. They think, HCPs think that patients should or would enjoy an infographic format better, but hands down, they want that navigable visual SRD. Next slide. So when patients were asked, and I believe that the N number of patients in the FACT-MI survey was around 1,000, so it's not a small sample size. Patients' preferred format, and is it different than the one they used the most? And it turns out it is. Going from, I used the top 6 responses from a list of 11 choices, and clearly patients prefer and in fact seek out and use consultation with their personal HCPs. It's number 1. on both, in both channels for both questions. They most preferred it and they used it the most. And as I recall, the number was very large. Overwhelmingly, they prefer verbal interactions with their HCP, and they use and seek out verbal interactions with their HCP. But let's go down for the rest of them. For what they prefer on the left, they prefer text with some graphs. Next, it would be written text. Next would be infographics, and then verbal with the pharmacist, and then video. But what do they use? And this is kind of interesting. Again, the verbal HCP is first, written text is second, and then showing up out of nowhere as one that did not make it what they prefer, but it made it onto what they use, is print and TV ads. Followed after that with text with some graphics, infographics, and video. So the outlier is the print and TV ads that they say they use. But on their preferred list, well, on their preferred choices, I can tell you that the print and TV ads was very far down on the list from what they prefer. So why did it show up so high on the used question? One interpretation that is just mine could be that respondents equated the word used with, well, I've watched it or heard it or listened to it on the television or radio, so I guess I've used it, which could indicate they were passively exposed to the content and didn't really seek it out at all, but they interpreted the word used as they were exposed to it. So that's my own personal thought about why that outlier showed up over here. But there might be some lessons learned there, is that they're listening. You know, it's kind of hard if you're watching television, it's pretty hard to avoid advertisements for drugs, primarily drugs. So again, it's penetrating. Those messages are getting to them. We won't say that they prefer them, but they are hearing them. So next slide then, Olivia. So there are some good arguments for, so as I was saying earlier, there are some good arguments for careful choices in designing effective marketing assets and incorporating plain language content wherever you can, even if it is those marketing assets are intended for the HCP. So here's more results from the FACT-MI study. Patients' most common rationales for format preference choices were, it usually gives me what I want. I trust the information and I am familiar with it and it is easy to understand. How do you think that relates back to plain language? What struck me about those responses is that it's familiar and easy to understand. That's plain language. It gives me what I want. That's plain language. I trust the information. You know, again, plain language can help increase the trustworthiness of information presented to patients. So their preference choices support the use of incorporating plain language content into the resources intended even for HCPs, because HCPs share that content with their patients. And then look at the second. Patients' most common rationales for not preferring a format were, I don't trust the information, it's not convenient, and it doesn't answer my question quickly. So those are some learnings about rationales for format, choosing the format. Next slide. So what are our key takeaways? We're almost done with our presentation here. What are our key takeaways? The incorporation of plain language content into HCP-focused marketing assets enhances its value. expands the target audience, and supports key HCP patient discussion. Plain language content is not just for the patient and caregiver consumption. HCPs also report benefiting from plain language content incorporated into assets intended for them. Because patients and caregivers prefer to receive medical information through conversations with their HCP, plain language content can provide a useful tool to add value to the HCP to support these patient conversations. So again, the HCP can use the plain language content in order to talk more effectively with their patients in having those discussions. Writing and creating medical information to the consumer must be informative, add value to them, and be trustworthy. Final thoughts. Coming up, here we go. These are final thoughts that I saw commented on actually in another medical information, marketing information seminar that I attended. And afterwards, they sent people's comments after the end of that webinar or that seminar. And some of them struck me as being very relevant to our conversation today. This was a different seminar. It certainly wasn't this, but it was there was an aspect of plain writing in that particular seminar. And look what people commented on. Simplification and segmented, giving the right information to the right audience. Well, that's certainly the hallmark of any good communication. Clear and concise, customized messaging. And there is not one mode of communication. Oops, I've got a typo there. Sorry about that. That fits all. And we have to diversify outreach in order to reach and communicate to all sectors. That concludes our comments for today. We've gone on quite a bit. We'll have time for probably only 2 or 3 questions, I'm sorry to say. But Olivia, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Lori. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Let's go ahead and get to our first one. All right, here's our first question, Lori. What are the golden or most important rules for a medical writer creating a plain language content for HCPs?
There are many. I would say the ones that we follow within our company is to first understand the intent of the messaging. What is the job of the message and the content? What needs to be conveyed in that messaging? You have to understand the intention of the content first, so that you can begin to try to convert it to plain language or incorporate plain language into it that supports that intention and the goals of the content. So I would say that is one of the most important rules, because we get many questions about around the notion or the confusion about, but how do we maintain the original message and information when we have to convert it to plain language? Doesn't that dumb it down, or isn't that simplification? Isn't that going to create more confusion, or you're not going to get the message right because we have to use different words? And so if that's one of the questions that you all have today, that is a big challenge. And that's another golden rule, is you have to maintain the original message and information, but still get it across in a way that your audience can understand using plain language.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's go on to another question here. Can you give some solutions to common pain points? For example, how to standardize key messaging across multiple written deliverables and platforms?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it is a critical question to solve. for, that's for sure. So let's imagine now that we're embedded within a medical device or a pharmaceutical company, and we're part of the medical affairs department or scientific affairs, clinical affairs, whatever it might be called, that whose job it is to disseminate information on their products out to key stakeholders, whether they be HCPs, KOLs, or a lay audience. The first order of business always is to understand that within your organization, there are other key stakeholders. It's not just the job of the medical affairs department to push that information out the door. So you gather your other key stakeholders together and create that matrix of information that we had on another slide, where you standardize the messaging, you agree to what are the key points to put across, what needs to be maybe left out or could be left out, and what are your key assets that you want to utilize. And you write that all down, and it becomes the framework for an entire scaffold or platform, if you will, that no matter who is putting out the information, whether it's a medical writing team, whether it's an individual within medical affairs, whether it's a KOL that wants to create some content on their own, you've got those key messages, those key data points, those key findings agreed upon. And so that is those standardized messaging, even the actual key phrases that everyone can use over and over again, that helps to coordinate across multiple people and multiple sources of information being sent out. It helps to coordinate and standardize your messaging and data. Maybe one more?
Sure, I think we have time for one more. This next one I thought was an interesting one. How do you recommend going about getting a peer review and documenting the results of the peer review for plain language writing?
Oh, that is another great question, because at the end of the day, how do you can use readability, suitability tools, you can too, when you create plain language, and you should. But does it still resonate with the audience, the intended audience? So when we've created plain language assets that are meant to go directly to patients, on behalf of a client that wants to get the message out to a segment of a patient population about a new drug or a new finding for a drug or device. Our job is to convert complex information into information that the intended audience can understand. Of course, that's the job of plain language. But if you really know your target audience and you have access to patient advocacy groups or other types of sources of patients that can screen or be involved with the development of plain language assets meant for them and others like them, that is by far the most powerful peer review you can get. So I know that our clients have sometimes gone back to patient advocacy groups or other types of patient-centric groups that they maintain contact with and ask them to review peer, do a peer review on plain language assets to make sure that, and then do a survey. Did they understand it? Did they take away, were the messages correct? Did they take away the right messaging? Was there confusion? Do you need to make any adjustments to the language so that there is better comprehension and assimilation of the information?
All right, thanks, Lori. I think that's a good place to end on. If you still have questions on the content we discussed today, or if you'd like to learn about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with our specialists. send us an email to consult@criterionedge.com, this email that you see on your screen. Thank you everyone for attending, for all your great questions. We hope this presentation gave you more insight into effectively writing plain language for HCPs. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.